I'm skimming across the surface of my own history, moving fast, riding the melt beneath the blades, doing loops and spins, and when I take a high leap into the dark and come down 30 years later, I realize it is as Tim trying to save Timmy's life with a story. Oral history is a vehicle that can save the lives of the past. By conducting an oral history, a historian chooses which stories survive, and by neglecting it, which stories perish. My personal experience with oral history actually began with a totally different medium, that of film. More specifically, it began with this film, Stanley Kubrick's Vietnam War movie Full Metal Jacket. And one specific scene made me want to learn more. In this scene, the protagonist Joker is attempting to dispatch an enemy sniper, and it has an unusual reveal. I thought to myself, who is this young woman? How did she get to the point where she was attacking American Marines in a blasted up building in Hue? Luckily for me, historical scholars were ready for my questions. One such scholar is Sandra Taylor, who engages in oral history to tell a rich story in Vietnamese women at war. She details the struggles the Vietnamese people faced before American involvement in Vietnam and what role women played in the war. By interviewing subjects who participated in the event, Taylor is able to give a new perspective in an important moment in American history. She talks to women who fought for the Viet Cong and tried to uncover how communism affected them during and after the conflict. An important facet of oral history is granting autonomy to research subjects. This method allows for Taylor's interviewees to tell their stories, and perhaps supersede an alternate narrative. She also pays attention to women who weren't strictly fighters and how they contributed to the war effort. She tells of women who smuggled supplies and constructed hidden bunkers and tunnels. She quotes a village woman using a pseudonym as retelling this story.
I dug a hole under the pig pen and another beneath the drainage channel in the fruit tree. When the enemy attacked, I would make animal sounds to alert party members to go underground and move from one hole to another with the connecting tunnels. One man was a high party official. No one but my husband and I knew he was there. Neither the ARVN nor the Americans ever found it.
Oral history has allowed Sandra Taylor to preserve the stories of women who Western audiences would likely have never heard from, but alone she is only telling a small, isolated piece of a greater narrative. If we think of women in combat as a research subject, we can identify Taylor as only one piece of a larger picture. Svetlana Alexievich isn't a historian, but a journalist. However, that doesn't mean historians can't learn anything from her. I would argue that anyone can train themselves to learn how to conduct an oral interview, and by preserving that interview, they leave a source for historians to use in years to come. Alexievich as a journalist is perhaps better suited for conducting interviews, but it's important for a scholar to remember that a journalist's objective is different from what their own discipline might be. With that being said, the unwomanly face of war serves as an excellent primary source for historians, because Alexievich details each of her interviews, allowing her subjects to speak on their own rather than offering analysis and interpretation every step of the way. The art is in what she chooses to include in her story. Alexievich is still in control of her narrative, just in a more subtle way than perhaps Taylor would be. When people think of women serving in the Soviet Army during World War II, most jump to the presence of women serving as snipers. Alexievich shows readers the many different roles that women served in. The Night Witches, for instance, were a group of women pilots who would cut their engines over bombing targets in order to launch stealth assaults on installations in cities at nighttime. While women were typically pushed away from serving in rifle divisions, nothing could be done to stop women from joining partisan units attacking German supply lines and protecting their homes. On the ground, too, women served as tankers, piloting a wide array of combat vehicles such as the T-34 tank. Women such as Alexandra Sumasenko represent a niche of combat servicewomen that most of the world likely didn't know existed. But here's the problem with Samasenko, and the challenge she represents to oral historians. She was killed in action in 1945, as the Soviet Red Army was pushing through Poland toward Berlin. She represents the sometimes short clock that historians and journalists have to create their interview and seal a story in history. Samasenko represents pressure on historians to be mindful of the modern world around them, and to not simply trust in others to record important recollections. Alexievich works with what she has, and manages to preserve many stories that are relevant today. And like Taylor, not all of her stories are about fighting directly. She also gets at ideas of PTSD and the struggle that women soldiers faced in getting treatment in the post-war era.
I became better in the war, unquestionably. I became better as a human being, because in war there is a lot of suffering. I saw a lot of suffering, and I suffered a lot myself. There, what's most important in life is immediately swept aside. It's superfluous. but the war took its revenge on us.
We can hear that Alexievich tapped into an emotional story, and that story would be lost to us today if she had just sat idle. And even when done, work like Alexievich's doesn't just sit, it can inspire. We have a generation now where Soviet women under arms are becoming increasingly visible. For example, there is a comic book in development written and drawn by Kyoto Kume, which uses Alexievich as source material. In Relic's 2013 strategy game, Company of Heroes, a player using the Soviet army can recruit snipers and tankers, which have a random chance to be voice acted by either men or women.
Sniper under fire! Get down! Down!
For the last stage of our story, our travels will take us to Mexico, Cuba, and South America. Here, Karen Kampworth documents the trials and tribulations of women who fought in revolutionary armies during times of strife. More similar to the cases of Vietnam and less the Soviet Union, these women weren't fighting in state-sponsored armies, but in revolutionary movements. In some ways, Kampworth directs our meta-plot to the modern world, telling of how women fought in guerrilla conflicts in South America and how their descendants are still fighting. But her story is rooted in very old origins, with documentation of women fighting in Mexico in the Mexican Revolution or the Mexican Civil War. This causes Kampworth's narrative to span over 100 years, as women started fighting in 1910, and their descendants are engaged in conflict still today. Examining the photographs of some of her subjects, we can see from the photo quality, style of dress, and the arms women carried that her story is a multi-generational one, and telling it in one book will likely be impossible. Kampworth also doesn't just interview women for historical material. She interviews men to try to see how women were perceived, and not just what women did and what women remembered. She quotes a Zapatista revolutionary who at the time, and even today, is really only known as Sub-Commander Marcos.
She came to the mountains of the Lacandan jungle in December 1984, not yet 20 years of age, and yet carrying the marks of a whole history of indigenous humiliation on her body. In December 1984, this brown woman says, "Enough is enough," but she says it so softly that she only hears herself. In January 1994, this woman and several thousand indigenous people not only say, but shout, "Enough is enough," so loudly that the whole world hears them.
But Kampworth isn't isolated from Taylor or Alexievich. Nothing happens in a vacuum. By reading just our three selections, we can see a story beginning to form larger than just women with guns fighting. In this story, we've seen mostly communist revolutions being the spark that sends these women at conflict, and there's a relationship there that can be digested. Similarly, many of these women were religious, but conservative religious beliefs often restricted a woman's ability to openly fight. There are many conversations that a historian could unveil using just these three books. With so little reading, we have spanned 3 continents and languages uncounted. It's clear that oral history can lift a lot of weight. Adding your own contribution is intimidating, but it is rewarding. Oral history is something you can practice and learn to do. There are a plethora of guides online that give good boundaries and strategies, a baseline for questions to ask potential subjects. The 2 that I like the most are the Oral History Association and the Smithsonian Folklife and Oral History Interviewing Guide. The story discussed here today is just one, and it isn't finished. There are women fighting essentially all over the world, such as Kurds in the Middle East, and women in Zimbabwe protecting their homes. If you want to get more historical, exploring women who fought in the Spanish Civil War is another potential avenue to add up to the conversation being brought up today. But you don't have to go out and fly somewhere expensive and learn a new language just to try to save a story. There are plenty of stories here, with us. Start with your parents or grandparents. You never know where their stories might take you and what you might learn next.